So the second social identity that your book tackles is race. And so, before we get into those gender strategies that they talk about in regards to Blacks, whites, and Asians, let's talk about race, generally speaking. So, we can look around, well, maybe not now because we've all been quarantined and isolated for months, but, you go out in public, you look around, you can see that human beings have physical differences. And this is, in terms of their features, the shape, of their eyes or lips or nose, their skin color, hair texture, height, eye color. So we look differently, and this is what we call phenotype, what you look like. And there was this long assumption that because we look so different, we must be different on the genetic level, what's called genotype, what our genes are. And that, because we have these different genes, clearly we're different races. We're all part of the human species, but, we're subspecies, if you will. And that was an assumption for a very long time. And we, and it was an assumption that had a lot of social weight. We enslaved people over that assumption. We made laws allowing, people, dictating, where people could live and whether or not they could vote and whether they can remain in a country, whether or not they could own property. We being human society, particularly here in America, we spent a lot of time invested in this idea that we are different, not just in terms of looks, but at the genetic level. But lo and behold, a couple of decades ago, as we developed the technology to break down the human genome, and that was called the Human Genome Project, what we discovered is that genetically, all human beings are nearly identical. We share something like 99% of our DNA with other humans. You can't actually see racial difference at the genetic level, meaning if you're looking at genes, you aren't going to be able to figure out who is white, who is black, who is Pacific Islander, who is Native American, who is Latino, based on, you looking at that person's genetic makeup. And so, that means that, yeah, on a biological level, race isn't real. But just because race isn't real, that doesn't mean the consequences of it hasn't been real. Because according to the Thomas theorem, which is a pretty significant theorem, it pops up in several areas of sociology. If people define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. We have spent centuries defining race as real. A lot of people avidly believing that race is real, believing that human beings are different, making laws based on this difference. So, 2 decades of scientists trying to convince people, what, it's not real. Like, despite how different we look, we aren't really that different at the genetic level. There are less differences in human beings at the genetic level than there are between fruit flies, let alone different types of dogs. Like, fruit flies have more variation at the genetic level than human beings do. So the science is there, but human kind of perception, it's not there. And so in this sense, we talk about race being a social construct, but it's a social construct that has a lot of power, right? So, we created it, and we now know that we created it, and there's very little biological basis for it. But, after centuries of upholding this creation and this construction, it's not going to go away anytime soon. And how people feel about it, how people treat people, how people perceive people, that is not going to change dramatically or extremely quickly, just because we now know that biologically the basis of race is pretty much moot. So, because we've created this concept, we have to be able to measure it. In our society, we collect a lot of data based on the concepts of race and ethnicity. And so now let's briefly just kind of distinguish between those 3 terms that people toss around interchangeably, but sociologically they're not interchangeable. They all have their very own distinct definition. So race, this is the idea that a group of people share physical similarities. They share physical traits. They share phenotype. They look alike. So oftentimes when we think about what characteristics have been racialized, the ones that have been used to base racial groupings on, the big three are obviously skin color is it's the biggest one, it's the most obvious one. And then also facial features. So shapes of eyes and noses and lips in particular. And then the third one being like hair texture. So we think, okay, you are a group of people because you all look alike. You are a race. You share physical characteristics. Ethnicity is the idea that a group of people have a relation to one another based on shared cultural characteristics. So it's like, okay, you are a group of people because you share a culture, and particularly the cultural components that we have highlighted as being significant for ethnic formation have been language, right? So you share a language. Really, when we're talking about Hispanics and Latinos, that's largely what we're saying there. You share a religion. So Jews, Muslims, they share, they are considered ethnic groups because they share the cultural component of religion. And once again, oftentimes there is still this kind of distinction between groups that we're wanting to pull apart as minority groups, because we don't necessarily think of like Protestants as being an ethnic group, or we don't necessarily think about Presbyterians being a unique ethnic group. But we'll come back to that kind of concept of majority and minority groups here in a second. The third kind of cultural component that we in America we have lifted up as being a possibility that people can base an ethnicity around has been like nation of origin. And that brings me to nationality, because nation of origin and nationality aren't quite the same thing. So your nation of origin is the idea, okay, if you trace your lineage back, where do you land? So when we talk about Italian Americans or Irish Americans, we usually aren't talking about first generation immigrants from Ireland or Italy. We're talking about people that can trace their ancestry, their heritage back to those places. And so we say that they are an ethnic group in the sense what they share is this tie to the old country. Now, nationality is the nation that you are from, the nation that you were born in. And so it's worth noting that, sometimes people ask about people's nationality, when they're really wanting to ask about their ancestry or their lineage. But that use of nationality is not correct. Now, unless you're talking to a person that you know for a fact to be an immigrant, most people, if you're asking their nationality, the correct answer, if they were born here in America, is that it's American. If what you're wanting to know is, 2-3 generations ago, did they originate out of Italy, or did they originate out of Syria? Did they originate out of Ecuador, right? Then you wouldn't ask that question in that way. So when we're talking about groups of people in America, oftentimes we will combine these two terms, race and ethnicity, and we'll refer to a group as being a racial ethnic group, which is just kind of code for, you're a group of people who kind of look alike and you share some type of cultural component, even if it's just kind of a distant home country generations ago. And so in America, we have what's called the 5-group racial ethnic configuration. That's the one that we use most often, where we split our population into 5 groups. And those groups are white, non-Hispanic. Sometimes you might even see them as whites of European descent, is a way that you perhaps have seen this. In the past, Caucasian was a much more popular term, largely fallen out of favor now. The second group is Blacks or African Americans. Then you have Hispanic or Latinos. Those aren't perfectly interchangeable. There are, although they have a lot of countries in common, it's depending on who you're referring to, or especially if you're wanting to refer to the entire group, it is just safest to combine the two, so that you're capturing, Latinos they reflect, of course, people who are from the areas that we would consider to be Latin countries. So it is like a geographical designation, while Hispanic refers to places that speak Spanish. So that is a linguistic designation. So yeah. So just to say that, I go back and forth between my use of the terms. And for a lot of countries, they are both Hispanic as well as Latin. But there are a couple of countries, that aren't Latin or aren't Hispanic, particularly for the non-Hispanic Latinos, the countries where, they speak Portuguese, for instance. But anyway, that was a long aside. The fourth group is another kind of umbrella group. We're combining Asians, Native Hawaiians, as well as other Pacific Islanders. And then the fifth group are, American Indians, Alaska Natives, Native Americans. A more popular recent term has been First People. So that is what we have there. Now you see in parentheses there some percentages. So that was the racial ethnic makeup of America in the 2010 census. We collect this information about our entire population every 10 years. Hopefully all of you have taken your most recent census, and that data has not at this point come out yet. So obviously this data is already just it's dated, but it's the best that we have until the 2020 data is released. But at 2010, whites, non-Hispanic whites were 65% of the population. Blacks were 13%. Hispanic Latinos were 16%. Asian, Native Hawaiians, other Pacific Islanders were 5%. And American Indians, Native Americans, Alaska Natives were 1%. And those questions from the 2010 census, we got that data from the questions that looked like what you see there. First we asked about Spanish, Hispanic, Latino ethnicity, because we measure Hispanic, Latino as an ethnic group. Then we asked about people's race. And so the racial groups were white, Black, American Indian, Alaska Native, when we encourage people to write their principal tribe. Then we give several options for our Asian Pacific Islander category. And then we have some other race. And so this is why we will, talk about whites and Blacks in particular as being like non-Hispanic white or Black Latino, because we're combining the data from those two questions. And this also means, of course, for people who consider themselves Hispanic or Latino, in America, at least, we are currently not measuring that as a race. So they are, in fact, expected to go and mark themselves as being a race. I know because I once did work with the 2010 census data. A very large number of them would go to question 8 and then rewrite the same information from question 7 under some other race, basically stating that they were Mexican or they were Cuban or they were Honduran. This was not what the people who created the census planned. So it's worth noting that that is kind of a data fail. So we are a racially diverse country. That does not mean, of course, that we are a racially equitable country. Some of that, of course, has to do with our longstanding racialized policies that made it harder for some racial ethnic groups to get an education, to buy property, to open businesses, to experience upward mobility. And so in our country, we do have an issue with racial inequality. And so out of that comes the term majority and minority groups. And so the majority group, and this is always something that trips students up because the word majority sounds like it has to be the numerical majority. And in the case of the United States, where whites are our majority group, they are our numerical majority as well, and they will likely continue to be our numerical majority for at least the next 30, 40 years. But it's worth noting that the majority group does not have to be the numerical majority. It just means that this is the group that has more than their proportionate share of social resources. And so another term and that you can use if that whole majority group thing is confusing for you is the term dominant group. Now, I don't like to use the term dominant group because when you talk about a dominant group, that means you have to refer to the other groups as subordinate groups. And that terminology just doesn't sit right with me. I prefer to talk about groups in terms of majority or minority. But certainly if you're the type of student who really just can't get it out of your head that the majority group is not necessarily the numerical majority. Think about, for instance, South Africa during apartheid. White Afrikaners were not the numerical majority, but they were very much the majority group because they were the group that had the higher education, that owned the property, that opened the businesses, that held all of the political positions. The fact that they were numerically small meant very little because they were powerful in resources. And so it's worth noting that even if non-Hispanic whites stop being the numerical majority in the upcoming decades, unless there are some pretty significant shifts in terms of political positions, property ownership, business ownership, it's unlikely that just because they stop being the numerical majority, that they're not going to still be the majority group. If they still have that disproportionate share of the social resources. And by social resources, once again, I'm referring to the good stuff: political power, wealth, employment, education, privilege. So that's what's meant by majority group. And so the groups that aren't majority groups are pretty much minority groups, and they are groups that are disadvantaged in regards to those social resources. But going beyond their disadvantages in resources, minority groups are also more likely to experience racism. And so for this class, although this is a contested concept, or more particularly, it's a contested definition. The definition that I like is the belief that one racial group is inferior to another, a belief that is further upheld by the practices of the dominant group to maintain the inferior position of the dominated group. Some people want racism to be all about, oh, you hate people of another race. But at that point, racism then doesn't sound very different than just what it means to be prejudiced, right? Where you are prejudging, you have a negative opinion, attitude, belief about people based on a characteristic like race. Based on their group membership in one of those social identities. If you limit racism to how people feel or what people think, in that sense, it's no different than a term that we already have, which is prejudice. But people get upset with that definition of racism because they get hung up on this idea that only the majority group can be racist. And to that I say, oh, well, because it isn't about what people feel. There are plenty of people who can dislike me. But if your dislike is backed by a system that prioritizes you over me, that believes that your life has more value than mine, that takes your word more readily than they'll take mine, that is what gives your dislike power. Because people of all races can be prejudiced, but people of all races don't have the power to really ruin someone's life, or perhaps even take someone's life on the basis of that dislike. And so in this way, I think a good way to kind of think about, racism, it's prejudice plus discrimination plus power, right? It's that negative thinking, negative sentiment towards a group of people, combined with not treating them equally or treating them unfavorably, but then also having societal power, which largely allows you to do this with very minimal consequence, and perhaps a society that even supports you in doing this.